welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today, as we wrap up our unit on ancient China and Japan, we're actually going to get to Japan. We're going to look at early Japan here. We're going to look at a couple of unique features about early Japan, including a little bit of their geography, a little bit of high-end culture, and we'll finish with feudalism here. So in a way, this is a real snapshot of early Japanese history. We've only got one constructive response question we're going to attempt to answer in today's lecture. It's pretty simple. It says describe feudalism in Japan and specifically how the samurai were a part of it. So we will look at what feudalism is, we'll talk about some of the main players, and we'll talk pretty extensively about the samurai. So our path to learning here, what will we learn? We're going to talk a little bit about the geography to start out with. We'll look at the early Japanese culture, and then we are going to finish with that Japanese feudalism, which will feature the samurai. So when we look at early Japan and set the stage here, we have to understand location matters. Japan lies just east of China. You've got several seas over by China. You've got the East Yellow Sea, you've got the South China Sea, you've got the Pacific Ocean over there. There's definitely a lot of water. And Japan is going to get its name from being in the east. We know that the sun rises in the east, so Japan got its name from the Chinese word Raiban, which means land of the rising sun. If you look east, you'd see the sun rising. That's where Japan was located, so that's where that name comes from. As mentioned, Japan has borrowed ideas, institutions, and culture from China for thousands of years. Japan, in a way, is sort of a late bloomer to this story. They actually come quite a bit later than the Chinese. We know the Chinese have been around for over 4,000 years, but Japan's going to come just a little bit later in history, hence why we're studying them a little bit later after the Chinese. So Japan's culture is not as old as China's, but it's still very rich and unique. As I mentioned, typically in these lectures, if at any point you need to stop and want to look at something, or if I go too fast, feel free to pause and do so. So I think most of us know where Japan is. It's a very historically important country for a lot of reasons, dating back obviously to World War II and beyond that. So if we look at mainland China here we got Mongolia, where the Mongols came from. Japan's just over here to the east. Notice Japan is islands, made up of many, many islands, and that's going to be significant in this story as well. So let's talk a little bit more of that geography of Japan. So Japan is made up of over 4,000 islands, which makes it an archipelago. An archipelago is an island chain. From top to bottom, the archipelago of Japan here is 1,200 miles long. You can see it's very, very narrow. So the Japanese are going to sort of be at a disadvantage when it comes to farmland and resources, because 1,200 miles may sound like a lot to you and I, but when you look at all the water and all the hills that Japan's going to have, it's going to make survival there a little bit more difficult. Now, as you can see from this image, historically the Japanese have lived on the 4 largest islands. There are many, many islands of Japan. Obviously, we said over 4,000, but these are the main 4. So going from the north, we have Hokkaido, which you can see here. Moving south, we have Honshu, we have Shikoku, and then we have Kyushu. And you will need to know these. These were on your map assignment. That was done intentionally. So you will need to know those. And I've got a little trick to try to remember these 4. If you had to pick these off of a map and say which one goes to which island, if you notice the first 3, Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, they all go in alphabetical order. Kyushu is the only one that's definitely the one that does not fit that mold. So I always remember the one with the K is in the south, but the other 3, H-O-K, H-O-N, S-H-I, they definitely go in alphabetical order. So I don't know if that helps you or not, but those 3 are alphabetical. Kyushu is the one that stands alone. So, talking about their climate, southern Japan has a mild climate with plenty of rainfall. It's fairly warm there. Japan is very mountainous, though. I mentioned this on the previous slide. You can see from this image down here. That makes for a picturesque, beautiful place, but as you can see, roughly only 12% of their land is suitable for farming. That poses problems to people who are living there. You have to be able to adapt, you have to be able to trade, you have to be able to do a lot of different things to survive. So natural resources are in short supply, specifically coal, oil, and iron ore. If you remember in World War II, for those of you who studied American history last year, there's no doubt that that is one of the reasons that led Japan to be imperialistic and to try to take over a lot of other countries in the region because they wanted their coal, oil, and iron ore, which are very necessary during war times. Now, typhoons, you don't really hear about those in this part of the world because we call them hurricanes. So tropical storms called typhoons can occur late during the summer months and early fall. And we know, I mean, we've seen the devastation that's happened in our country. They can definitely be very, very detrimental. So that's definitely a challenge that the Japanese people face on a yearly basis. And of course, earthquakes and tidal waves are also dangerous threats to the island. Tsunamis can be very, very detrimental. And we've seen that in the news in the last decade or so. If there's an earthquake underwater, it can cause the water to rise, and these tsunamis or tidal waves can be a threat. So when you're surrounded by water, that's always something that has to be at least a consideration in terms of environmental challenges. Now, we're going to move a little bit into early Japan, kind of who they were, what they believed in, how they got their culture, and things like that. So as I mentioned, Japanese culture, it is very old, but we don't know how far back it really goes because the first written records only date back to the 1st century BC. You're talking 100 BC. That's not that long ago. To you and I, maybe, but to put this in perspective, the Greeks, who we haven't studied yet, they're long gone. The Romans are getting started. A group called the Persians, who we haven't studied yet, they're long gone. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of cultures has come and gone by the time we start seeing written records from Japan. So they're definitely not as culturally significant in the BC days as some of the other ones because we don't know that much about them because of those written records did not exist. During the 1st century BC, Japan was not unified as a nation. It was made up of hundreds of clans that controlled their own territories. This is kind of like the early Mongols. This is kind of like the early Chinese. You didn't have one emperor ruling everything. You had a lot of smaller groups. And that's somewhat typical of early cultures. One of the clans that really established itself was the Yamato clan. The Yamato clan established itself as the leading clan by 400 AD. Again, to put that in perspective, this is about the time Rome is starting to fall. So this is definitely a little bit newer in history. The Yamato chiefs called themselves emperors, and this idea gradually was accepted into Japanese culture. So this is where the Japanese emperor originated from. When one clan was defeated, the winning clan claimed control of the next emperor. So you can imagine that led to a lot of conflict. If we wanted to have our person be emperor, we had to defeat the other clan that was in power. So there was definitely conflict that occurred here in Japan early on. Just like the Chinese, the religion of the Japanese was not incredibly relatable. We don't see the creator gods that we see in Christianity or Islam. So what you had here in early Japan was that each clan worshipped its own gods and goddesses. And all this combined, these beliefs combined to form Japan's earliest religion called Shinto. Well, Shinto meant the way of the gods. So we're talking about polytheism here, multiple gods. Shinto was based on respect for the forces of nature and the worship of ancestors, which really shouldn't shock us because across the sea over in China, respect for ancestors and respect for nature have always been very important. So we see some similarities there. They also worshipped and believed in something called kami. Kami meant the divine spirits that dwelled in nature. So there again, we have our connection to nature. So in a nutshell, that makes up the early Japanese religion called Shinto. As we progress and look a little bit more at the Japanese culture, we do have to at least talk about Buddhism. Now, Buddhism spread from India over to East Asia, and it's not predominant in Japan, but we do see it there. How did it get there? Well, it got there from Korean travelers. Korean travelers brought Buddhism and was officially accepted by the Japanese imperial court in the mid-700s AD. So trade spreads ideas. That's definitely a theme we've seen all semester long, and we will continue to see that. Trade brought these Korean travelers when they brought Buddhism with them. Buddhism spread to Japan, but the Japanese never truly abandoned Shinto. So, truth be told, we kind of get a hybrid of both of them. So, some Buddhist rituals became Shinto rituals. Sorry about that. Some Buddhist rituals became Shinto rituals, and some Shinto gods and goddesses were worshipped in Buddhist temples. So, what we basically see is a little bit of a hybrid of Shinto and Buddhism. If we want to talk about the Japanese culture, we have to talk about where it came from. We just mentioned those Korean travelers. Well, borrowing from China was very important. Interest in Buddhist ideas grew into enthusiasm for all things Chinese. A lot of people in Japan said, hey, the Chinese have a lot of great things. And they did. They really did. I mean, we've talked about porcelain and silk and gunpowder and paper, compass, all sorts of great things. So there's no doubt the Japanese are going to be interested in that as well. So it was this guy who you see on the bottom of your screen, Prince Shitoku, who happened to be a Buddhist convert, meaning he converted to Buddhism. He sent out the first of 3 missions to China. And the goal of these missions was simply to study Chinese civilization. They want to see, hey, what do the Chinese have that we should bring back to our country here in Japan and begin adopting? Again, those are trade missions. Those are there to bring back good ideas. It's definitely something that the Japanese did. All right, we're going to end there for now. That's going to be the end of part 1. To continue on this story, to talk about what they borrowed specifically from the Chinese, as well as Japanese feudalism, go ahead and please play part 2.